If a voice whispered through the fog in notes no one else could hear, would it be a warning or a welcome? They call the headland Brackenmere, a quiet fold of cliffs on the North Wales coast where gulls draw pale circles over water that keeps old stories close to its chest. In the spring of 1889, the tide bell failed for a week, and the village blamed the damp. But Era Rowe heard another reason in the wind that pressed against the lighthouse glass at dusk. Her mother, a lantern tender with the softest patience, used to hum 6 steady notes to calm storms in Era's chest, and when those same 6 seemed to rise from the fog, Era stood by the rail and answered with a hum of her own. The sound returned with a second line, not a copy, but a reply, and the gap between the answers felt measured, like someone counting without numbers through a pattern only the sea remembers. Era brought a small page from the logbook and marked the pauses as ticks, then turned them sideways like a ladder, because a teacher once told her that sometimes music is just numbers behaving kindly. She tried to count 1 to 5 and failed, because the tones kept resetting after the 6th beat, as if the water preferred a bass 6 rhythm and refused to step into the 7th without cycling back. It did not feel hostile, only insistent, like a guest who knocks with the same knuckle until the right door opens. Still, she said nothing at breakfast, because people in Brackenmere like their mysteries to be either legends or weather, and this was neither, at least not yet. Her father kept the lanterns healthy and the brass bright, but even he had begun to fear the whispers around the quay, whispers that the rose had slipped, that the mist last winter was mishandled, that the bell had missed its mark when a small skiff scraped the outer reef and had to be steadied by neighbors with ropes and warm blankets after proper channels were quietly informed. Era knew that if she could chart the tones, she could time the fog belts and set the signal beat so clean that no boat would lose its way on their watch again. That was the first promise she made to herself on the catwalk that week, holding a pencil between finger and thumb until the wood stained gray. But that wasn't the whole story, because the second promise was softer and lived in her throat. She wanted the lullaby to mean something more than memory. By noon the next day, she visited Mrs. Bevan, the schoolroom keeper who loved puzzles and kept a drawer full of slate shards for children with restless hands. "Suppose words could be sung with 6 places instead of 10, Era said, and she tapped the desk 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then she cupped her hand for the 6th to show the set was complete before rolling back to 1 again. Mrs. Bevan smiled and fetched the little tuning fork used to settle rowdy afternoons, and the fork's chime found the exact spacing Era had marked in the margin of her logbook. When they layered 2 forks, the overtones braided and left a pattern on the air like a net, a simple lattice that could catch meaning if someone dared to name it. They named the bass unit Luma for the faint glow inside a note that refuses to be quiet. And Era counted Luma, Luma va, Luma ve, Luma tree, Luma quar, Luma sen, and then returned to Luma while holding a small hitch to show the set had cycled with intention, not accident. Objects learned their own syllables in the next hour. Lamp was tor Luma, sea was mar sen, and when 2 lamps stood together, the word bent slightly to tor Luma va, a small proof that plurality could ride on harmony without crowding the tongue. Nothing about it felt forbidden. It felt tidy, as if the coast had been waiting for someone to listen with the right kind of patience. But then the bell on the jetty rang once without a breeze, and both of them turned, because sometimes tidy patterns bring visitors. A scholar from a maritime institute had arrived on the morning packet to catalog marine currents and train the newer hands on safe charts, and word ran ahead that he loved neat tables and disliked untested claims. Era was not afraid of doubt, only of being talked over, so she folded her notes into the skirt seam and went straight to the key before boldness could leave her.
"Sir," she said, "I think the fog talks in six." And she laid out the forks and the ladder of ticks with the care one reserves for a treasured book. He listened, then drew a long breath and thanked her for the helpful curiosity, adding that the Institute already had robust models and that community safety would continue through established signals reviewed by proper channels. The words were polite, but something in the way he arranged his maps over her slate made the air heavy, like a door pushed almost shut but not latched. That evening the fog grew thick and slow, and the bell did not ask permission when it rang 3 times in that same measured way Ira had marked, with the 6th place echoing against the cliff face, as if the stone itself answered back. She climbed the lighthouse stairs 2 at a time and set the light to a gentle swing that matched the cycle, not to replace procedure, but to weave with it so the beam felt like a companion, not a command. Down below, the packet returned early, guided by a line of lanterns from the quay and a rhythm from the headland that turned confusion into calm. And in the morning, people talked less about blame and more about a new steadiness that had settled in the bay. But that wasn't the whole story, because when Ira tried to write a simple greeting in the new speech, the marks on the slate began to ripple, not like a trick of the eye, but like heat above a summer road, and the overtones from the forks swelled without anyone striking them. Mrs. Bevan pressed her hand to the desk and felt a pulse through the wood, a quiet 6 that seemed to ask a question in return. They answered with a slower pattern, careful and kind, and the room cooled at once, as if the conversation had found an easier path. It was the first hint that this language did not want to be owned. It wanted to be respected the way one respects weather by learning to read it rather than demanding it change. Ira walked home with the forks wrapped in cloth and found her father on the steps polishing a brass hood that had already learned to shine without help because his hands could convince metal to remember its own best self. She explained the 6-beat cycle, the calm packet, and the scholar's careful dismissal, and her father listened without interrupting, then nodded once and said that sometimes the quickest way to earn trust is to let results speak in the open, not in argument. They decided to set a small trial for the weekend, not a replacement for any procedure, only an additional rhythm woven under the standard light to see whether returning boats found the bay easier in a certain kind of mist. Ira went to sleep with the forks under her pillow because she had learned as a child that hope is easier to carry when it hums against the cheek.
At dawn, the fog sat close enough to touch, and the scholar stood again on the quay with a ledger, noting arrival times while the harbor warden leaned on a post and kept the mood steady so no one felt pressured to choose sides. Era's first pattern was simple: luma, luma va, luma ve, luma tri, luma quar, luma sen. Then a pause that suggested welcome, not alarm, and a warm swing of the light to accompany the cadence. The answers came in small ways. A fishing sloop turning early, as if nudged by a friendly thought. A rowboat hugging the smooth water just inside the shoal. Man on the deck pointing, as if something unseen had mapped the safest arc for them. By noon, the ledger held neat ticks, the warden's shoulders had loosened, and the scholar asked if he could borrow a slate, which Era offered without triumph. Here's the twist. A second voice rode the fog that afternoon, slightly out of pitch, doubling the 6th so it struck the ear like 2 notes greeting and briefly disagreeing before finding the same home. Era steadied herself and switched to lantern code, short, short, long, with a soft rest, borrowing from the tide tables to make the answer feel local, not foreign. The double pitch eased, and the air settled,
and the scholar wrote a single sentence that made Era look toward the horizon. Perhaps we are hearing a system that aligns with our coast, rather than speaking over it. She let the words sit, because some recognitions work best when unhurried. But that wasn't the whole story, because the next evening a letter arrived from a neighboring cape, where they had seen odd glows in the fog, and heard a far rhythm that didn't match any bell. And they wanted to know if Brackenmere had noticed similar patterns, and whether a joint study might be kind to the coast. Era ran her finger under the line about a joint study, and smiled, not because of proof, but because it meant curiosity had started traveling by kind invitation rather than argument. She resolved to answer with diagrams anyone could follow, 6-place counting, simple word shapes, and a map of how the lighthouse's beam could hum with the tide rather than cut across it. And she penciled a small note to herself at the bottom: "Keep the lullaby honest." And then the bell rang once without a breeze, a polite reminder that the conversation was still going and that more would be asked of her than tidy charts.
If a language can guide ships home, what happens when the sea speaks back and asks for a promise in return? By the week's turn, the fog grew velvet thick, a patient wall that turned the harbor into a room with the window left ajar, and the ledger on the quay showed 3 boats still out where swells fold like slow breathing. The harbor warden requested calm coordination and noted that all standard signals would continue while any experimental rhythm, if used, must sit quietly underneath and never replace procedure. A boundary Ira respected without hesitation. She carried the forks in cloth and the slate in a tin, and the scholar walked beside her without commentary, which felt like the beginning of listening rather than the end of doubt. "Simple, measured, kind," Ira whispered, and the lighthouse beam answered with a steady arc that felt more like a hand held out than a command given. Here's the twist. The double voice returned, not hostile, but pressing, a second pitch riding the 6th, so the air trembled near the catwalk, and when Ira tapped Lumava, the 6th replied as if it had waited there all morning. She shifted tactics and wove lantern code into the 6th-place cadence: short, short, long, rest, short, long, long. So the pattern carried a welcome that matched the town's current, not a foreign insistence that might unsettle tired crews. Down on the water, a sloop adjusted by a hair's width and cleared a sliver of dark water that had tricked better eyes in other years, and a voice on the deck floated up with relief that sounded like gratitude in any language. Ira kept the rhythm gentle, and the scholar timed arrivals without drama, his pencil resting during rests, as if the ledger itself knew when to be quiet. But that wasn't the whole story, because the forks, sitting silent on the parapet, began to hum without being struck, an overtone like breath against glass, and Mrs. Bevan, who had climbed the stairs with a thermos, felt the stone under her palm count 6 with a pulse that asked a question rather than demanded an answer. "What does it want?" the scholar asked softly, not to extract a claim, but to spare the harbor from guesses. "Not worship," Ira said, watching the beam slide across fog like a skater who has learned mercy. "Just a partner who keeps the rhythm honest." The warden raised a hand, and the Quaku swung 3 lanterns in the simplest cycle, and together the human lights and the lighthouse line met the fog with a welcome that felt like a gate opening at walking speed. 2 boats came home neat, then the sea held its breath, and the last vessel stalled at the edge where shoals whisper cruel jokes to tired rudders, and Ira knew the next choice would define whether the village trusted the method or merely tolerated it. The scholar leaned in and offered a plan to keep within safe practice, Maintain standard bell intervals, add only a subaudible hum from the forks to trace the sixth quietly beneath, and extend the rest between cycles to signal patience rather than urgency. Ira nodded and placed the forks on the bronze ring, and the metal accepted the hum like old friends, remembering a shared song, and the fog let the sixth place bloom softer, like a candle lowered near a sleeping child. The vessel eased 1 degree starboard, then 2, then committed, and a cheer rose from the quay, not because anyone won an argument, but because home announced itself without drama.
The warden made a brief note that authorities were informed of the trial layering and that proper channels would review the logs in the morning, a sentence that kept peace better than any speech could. People drifted toward warmth with easy shoulders, and Ira remained on the catwalk with the scholar, counting the faint afterbeats that sometimes follow relief. "Your 6," he said at last, "feels less like arithmetic and more like tide-keeping with manners." "Then we'll keep it mannered," she replied, and they both laughed because care had found a shape they could agree to protect. That night Ira drew a clearer lattice on the slate, 6 columns, soft diagonals, and little hooks to indicate rests that ask rather than pause. And every time the chalk squeaked, she softened her hand so the marks looked like invitations instead of fences. She wrote the word for home as Haven Luma, then bent it for returning boats to Haven Sen, a touch that made the 6th feel like a porch light left on purpose. When she tried to write a greeting for the fog itself, the lines shimmered again like heat above a summer road, and she whispered, "We'll keep this gentle," and the shimmer faded as if satisfied with the promise. Ira slept with the slate under the bed because sometimes ideas need a roof as much as people do. Morning brought a letter from the neighboring Cape confirming a joint study invitation with simple goals: align rhythm under standard signals, share diagrams any crew could read, and keep changes gradual so trust grew from outcomes, not noise. Ira's father read the letter twice and smiled in that way brass sometimes smiles when it catches first light, and he set aside time to service the bell so the new harmony would sit on top of a healthy instrument instead of trying to correct a tired one. Mrs. Bevan sketched a clean base 6 table for classroom slates, no flourish, just clarity, and a note underlined in careful hand. Stories help understanding, but charts help steering. The scholar requested a listening station on the opposite cliff to test whether the 6th carried differently along rock strata, a notion Ira liked because it meant the coast itself would get a say. But that wasn't the whole story, because late afternoon brought an unsettling echo from beyond the reef, a 666 that stacked like scaffolding in the mist, too rigid to be natural and too tidy to be accident, a pattern that felt like someone practicing without the coast's consent. The scholar frowned and traced the beats in air, then shook his head because the rests were wrong, clipped short the way impatience clips conversation. Ira tasted metal on the back of her tongue the way one does when a storm holds lightning inside its pocket and refuses to admit it, and she tightened the lantern wick to keep herself from rushing the reply. "Welcome first," she said, "then correction," and she sent a soft cycle with generous rests, the kind that tell a guest there is room at the table, but also a pace to the meal.
The echo adjusted a breath, then doubled down on the rigid stack, and somewhere in the fog, a gull cried the way gulls do when they warn each other without scaring the fish, and Ira saw the conflict clearly at last. The antagonist wasn't a creature hiding under swells, or a rival with sharp elbows. It was a way of speaking that wanted control rather than care. A cadence that prized obedience over belonging, and if she matched it beat for beat, the harbor would learn the wrong lesson. So she refused the contest and returned to the lullaby. 6 places, open hands, a porch light. Then dimmed the fork's hum until it was almost memory, trusting crews and cliffs to do the rest. The rigid stack thinned, drifted, and finally dissolved like handwriting left in rain, and the fog eased against the headland as if embarrassed by its own earlier stiffness. The warden logged the episode as unsettling,
but resolved through patient pacing, and added a line that community calm remained intact, an entry that would age well when read by people who like quiet victories. Ira exhaled and let the beam swing wider, a small gift to nerves she hadn't admitted were frayed, and the scholar closed his ledger without totals, because some days are not for numbers. They walked the quay and answered practical questions: where to place the second listening station, how to teach the six to new hands without mystery, and how to keep diagrams friendly so no one felt shut out of their own coast. At the end, the scholar said, "Your six teaches patience the way good harbors do," and Ira answered, "Then the harbor taught me first," which pleased them both more than they said aloud. Night settled with polite stars, and Ira climbed the tower for one last look and found, tucked under the rail, a folded paper from a child who had spent the afternoon watching boats turn like slow dancers near the safe water. The drawing showed a lighthouse with a red heart where the lantern lived, and 6 small dots around it like friends holding hands. And under it, 3 careful words: "Keep it kind." Ira pinned the paper near the logbook because some instructions outweigh instruments, and she wrote a final line before sleep: "Tomorrow we teach, not to show we're right, but to share what works." And just before she closed the book, the bell rang once without a breeze, no warning, no alarm, only a reminder that the conversation continues when people choose to listen together.
What would be the first word taught to a sea that already knows how to sing? Home or promise? They chose both, and the harbor square filled with quiet eagerness as benches faced a chalkboard borrowed from the schoolroom, the bell polished to a calm shine, and the lighthouse lens resting like a lantern with perfect posture above them all. Ira drew 6 neat columns and wrote the counting as luma, luma va, luma ve, luma tri, luma quar, luma sen, then circled back to luma to show how the set completes itself without hurry, which made even restless hands relax. She spoke in simple lines so every deckhand and baker could follow, explaining that the 6th is not just a number, but a place to breathe, the rest that keeps neighbors from talking over one another when weather presses close. Mrs. Bevan lifted 2 tuning forks and let them chime, and the overtones braided into a soft lattice, while the scholar mapped the spacing on a clean slate so the pattern felt like a tool, not a trick. Here's the twist. A low fog wandered in from the north bank as if invited by lesson plans, and the bell on the jetty answered once, then waited like a polite guest at a doorway. Ira showed how words bend kindly in this speech. 1 lamp is tor luma, 2 become tor luma va, and the shoreline itself earns a gentle name, Haven Sen, when every boat is home and counted with care. The scholar added a simple rule that made heads nod. Never replace standard signals, layer the 6th beneath them so the harbor keeps its spine while the music keeps its manners. The warden echoed the point, noting that authorities were informed and that proper channels would review logs after the demonstration, which anchored curiosity to calm procedure. The fog thickened, and a distant hull tapped the swells with the caution of someone arriving late to a warm room, so Ira raised her hand and began the cadence with generous rests that sounded like chairs being pulled out at a long table. Luma, luma va, luma ve, luma tri, luma quar, luma sen, beam swing, soft pause, then lanterns along the quay joined in pairs like neighbors greeting one another across a narrow street, and the crowd felt the harbor inhale and exhale in agreement.
A boy near the front copied the rhythm on a biscuit tin without being told, and the tin's small voice fit neatly under the bell like a younger sibling learning patience, which made 3 older fishermen smile without admitting it. The hull adjusted a single degree, then 2, choosing a line that avoided the sly shoal by the old marker, and the bow slid past as if guided by a hand it trusted but never saw. But that wasn't the whole story, because a second pattern tried to climb into the space between 6th and rest, a stiff triple stack that clipped the breath short, and Ira felt the old urge to answer hard with hard, and decided against it in front of everyone. "We keep it kind," she said for the child with the biscuit tin, and she lowered the forks until they were almost memory, and let the beam carry the welcome while the bell kept time like a steady heart with room for visitors. The stack hesitated, softened, and dissolved the way ink does when a drop of clean water touches its edge, and a murmur went through the crowd that sounded exactly like relief choosing to become gratitude. Ira wrote one more note on the board for anyone who might teach this later. Rest means you first, and the scholar underlined it as if signing a modest treaty with the coast.
They codified the practice before dinner, the Brackenmere 6, 3 simple pages that any crew could pin inside a cabin, layer under standard signals, keep rests generous, document outcomes plainly, and end every sequence with haven sen, only when boats are home and accounted for, never as a promise offered too soon. The warden added a final line in tidy script. Community calm is part of safety, so the rhythm must always reduce pressure, never raise it, a reminder that good harbors protect nerves as carefully as hulls. Copies went to the neighboring cape with an invitation for joint listening posts and shared tide tables, and the letter closed with the gentlest boast, results first, stories later, which the scholar admitted was the only kind he likes. Ira folded her own copy into the logbook beside a child's drawing of 6 dots circling a lantern, proof that learning had entered the room through the front door and planned to stay. Twilight opened like a slow curtain, and the first stars found their places the way regulars find their seats, and Ira climbed the stairs for the evening watch with the forks wrapped in cloth so they would behave like guests, not hosts. She set the light to a swing that matched the coast's breathing and checked the bell's temper, then stood at the rail and tried a quiet greeting in the new speech, Haven Luma, and waited with a patience learned from many small repairs. The fog answered with a faint 6th that felt less like an instruction and more like a nod, and for the first time since winter, the air around the lens felt like a room that remembers laughter, even when no one is speaking. Below, footsteps on the quay settled into the same easy cadence, and the harbor took on that rare posture seen after good days, alert but unburdened, like a strong back after a kind stretch. Ira thought of her mother's lullaby and understood the part she had missed as a child. The 6 was never about control. It was a promise to listen long enough for the other voice to finish its thought, even when weather hurries the mouth, and that was why the song could calm storms inside ribs as well as out at sea. She promised aloud to keep the rhythm honest, to teach without spectacle, and to leave room for neighbors and neighboring capes to add their notes until the coastline sounded like itself again, not a rehearsal for a clause. The scholar closed the lighthouse door behind him so it would not rattle, thanked her for trusting data and patience at the same time, and left a small envelope with a sketched lattice and 3 words she would later pin beside the drawing. Belonging is measurable. The bell rang once without a breeze, a gentle full stop at the end of a kind paragraph.
and the beam reached out across smooth water like a porch light left on for someone who will always be welcome here.